as I was saying, you should see now we're signed into Sunrise. You can see this little floating window here. This is the EHR agent. Keep an eye on this. I'm going to go ahead and click on this patient, Thomas Jones, and you'll see the agent now recognize that Thomas Jones in context. Let me tell you what's going on here, what the workflow is. So regardless of the end user's EMR, they're going to continue to work in their EMR. There's no need to click, look outside into the HIE for additional information. And most of you know this, but for the most part, most of the information that we deal with is in our EMR. And if we have to click a separate button to go out to the HIE and get a negative hit, there's a disincentive for us to hit that button. So the idea behind the agent was to say, show me only what's relevant to me and let me continue to do all my work in the EHR. So what it's doing, that's all the information that's contained in DB Motion, all the community information. It's looking, so to speak, into the EMR. It's doing a delta analysis. And if there's no difference, so if my EMR is the king of the world, it's got all the information there and more, then I never need to be bothered with what's in the HIE. If, in fact, there is data out in the HIE, then and only then is it going to flash. And if it flashes, then if I click on it within, again, my own workflow, it's telling me there's new encounters, problems, diagnosis, there's no new imaging that's dithered out, et cetera. A couple things here, and I'm going to go into the clinical views in more detail, but the semantic vocabulary management piece of this is key. You don't want this thing flashing because I have an allergy to Bactrim in my chart and someone else has an allergy to Septra somewhere else out in the community. So the DB Motion capabilities around semantics, knowing, for instance, all these words means Septra, means sulfa, mean that this thing's not going to flash just because there's a new different type of allergy. It's going to be based on clinical significance. So there's grouping capabilities by diagnosis and problems, by meds and therapeutic class, et cetera, and I'll show you that. So real briefly, and again, we're going to come back to this, but the idea here is I'm looking at Thomas Jones's chart. I'm in his problem list right now, which lists community-acquired pneumonia and hypertension. Presumably he's hospitalized for pneumonia. And now from the community, I could see there's a whole host of other problems that were on other people's problem lists. So for instance, this coronary artery disease is relevant to me. And if I want to move that to my problem list, I'm going to hit send to my EMR here. See, it did that down on my system trail, hit refresh. And now the workflow is not going out, pushing, pulling, all these terms that we've used in the past. It's really almost as if I'm dragging and dropping something from someone else's problem list onto my current problem list. So I'm going to stop for 1 second because I'm going to go off this view. We're going to come back to it. But I want to show you the details behind this with sort of our classic clinical views. But this is the basic workflow. So let me stop and see if there's any questions. Kate will, I don't know if you're monitoring chat.
I am. You can type them into questions or into chat. I have both open. I've just responded to a few of your concerns when the audio wasn't working so well. Hopefully you can all hear, but I have chat and questions open, so go ahead and type.
And you can unmute people if they want to talk.
Yeah, if you let me know who you are, I'll see that and I can unmute you. Okay. I can't hear. Yes, I can hear you. Michael Suleman said that. Okay, great. Any other questions, or do you want Dr. Diamond to just go on? He'll continue unless you have a question that you want to stop right here for.
We're good?
Good.
Okay. So everybody presumably understands how this agent works in terms of workflow. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and open up sort of the sort of traditional view of how we activated DB Motion in the past, but only so you could see the details behind the data in the background. Then we'll come back to this. By the way, the other piece I'm going to show you is the population health tool that we call Collaborate, which allows some communication within and outside the HIE. It also allows to look at populations of patients, whether they're a list of all my patients or my patients in the hospital or my patients with diabetes or whatever the case may be. So I'll get to that in a second. So let me show you, we're back in Thomas Jones's chart. I'm now in Enterprise. The traditional way was to launch to these DB Motion views, but again, you're going to see that happening within that agent. But I did want to show you the details behind the scenes here. This is a summary screen, pretty self-explanatory, but let's start looking at all the encounters on this patient so we get an idea of the kinds of data and the complexity of the data. So you can see there's literally thousands of encounters on any particular patient here. The nice thing is we can sort this by where, who, whatever. If I just want to see the orthopedic encounters, I can do that. So I can sort and filter in any way I want to. Some places where I practice in Pittsburgh, we're lucky to get some claims data as well. So the UPMC health plan for me has added from January 4th to the 9th. Let me look at the documents from that, et cetera. Now what we're saying is here's all the stuff that was associated with that encounter. So with a single view now, I could see who saw the patient, what documents were associated with them, et cetera. By the way, what I didn't show you on an earlier view, but whenever we have data that's linkable, so to speak, we do that. So if there's a discharge summary, for instance, I don't have to go and click and go through a document tree. I could just click on that right at the point of care here, or if there's a cardiac cath note, I can do that. So I'll show you as we go along several other types of this. So for instance, if there's a procedure note and there's a pathology report associated with that, we always try to link those pieces together so you're not having, again, to search in a document tree to get at that associated information. So again, all this in the background, I mentioned when I showed you that agent about the semantics. This is both the problem and what I would say is the solution to that. And for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is a real live HIE-driven allergy list. It is 3 pages long, and it is one of those things that clinicians, when they see this, immediately say, I'd rather have no information than to see this for a couple reasons. Hang on one second. There's a question. Yes, Kate.
This is from Salman. At the end, I would like to see how the health issues from the community record were imported into SCM that also could be answered offline.
Okay.
Someone also said their audio dropped off, but now it's back. Lost the audio I got from a bunch of people. Lost it. It's back. Can you ask if people can hear you?
So just by chat, can you guys say if you can hear me now at all? If a couple of people say yes, we'll know that our audio is back. If not, we'll assume we lost it.
Yes, I see yes.
Bunch of yeses.
Back, yes.
All right,
okay.
good. Thank you very much, and keep letting us know. I'm not sure what we had some strange audio problems here today, so we'll keep moving with this. To Salman's question earlier about how we import the data into SCM, that gets back to the semantic issue, and I'll show it to you here in a second, and I'll explain what's happening. So give me 2 seconds to talk about the semantics here, and then that plays a huge role in how we move data from one EMR to another. So one of the things you see here is a lot of redundancy. There's sulfa, Bactrim, sulfa drugs, et cetera. And that's because, as you know, not every EMR is mapped to a single standard. There are multiple standards. If you think about meds, there could be RX norm, there could be medicine, there could be Multum, there could be in problems, there could be ICD-9, ICD-10, SNOMED, et cetera. And then there's free text, and there's local mapping that's done, there's IMO mapping that's done, et cetera. So you get these big complicated lists like this. The bigger problem is, I'll go to the 3rd page, and some of you have seen this before, one of them is that I don't have the time to go through 3 pages of allergies. The bigger problem is that on the 3rd page, there was a bad allergy. So there's an anaphylactic allergy that just kind of got lost in the busyness of all this junk that's out there in the HIE. So this is not our default view. This is how other people tend to provide HIE data. I'm showing that just for illustrative purposes. Our default view is this. So that semantic piece is, I know all that stuff we do is sulfa, and we can roll it all up under a single category. So a much more palatable list here. And again, that vancomycin allergy now pops up to the top of the list because of that. And to the question earlier, here is this vancomycin allergy. It was recorded in someone's EPIC chart over here. And if I want to move it to my EMR, I'm going to hit send to my EMR. We'll go back to my enterprise view here. Here's my allergy list. It says sulfa. I'll refresh, and now you can see vancomycin here. So now let me take a technical back turn here for a second. I didn't cut and paste the word vancomycin. It doesn't do any of us any good. All the associated metadata with that, who, what, where, what kind of allergy, et cetera, came over with us. So here's what we're doing, and it's the answer, Salman, to the question that you had earlier as well. We are out there listening to all this data from all the different EMRs, clinical sources, whatever they may be out in the community, that is publishing this data in their local terminology. So we take that in its local terminology. dbMotion has a core ontology. I'll talk more about the ontology, not just a vocabulary in a second, but a core ontology that we translate everything to once. So it's many, many languages. We're at the UN. Everybody's speaking a different language. We do a single translation to a single core language, what we call a baseline with that. By the way, we don't change the original data. We do that translation, but we also retain the original data information as well, which becomes very important later on from physicians' intent, analytics, et cetera. The next thing is, when you go to view that data, we do a translation back to your local code. So whatever language it is that you want to consume that data in, which becomes very important. So we don't have to do one to many and then many back to one. We only take many to one, and then we could translate it to any language we want. So that viewing of the data, that vocabulary is done on the fly. So it's local, baseline, local, all done on the fly, and that's how we can do it in this sub 5 seconds kind of way. So let me stop there. I know we have a lot of people on the line, but I want to make sure that key point there about the vocabulary, because it kind of drives everything. I've explained it clear enough. Any questions, Kate?
I don't see any right now. I'm looking.
Okay.
I see a thank you.
Okay, good. So this is real important. You're going to see this in other areas. So let me go to the med list here. The med list, you can see there's 122 meds active on this patient. You guys know this. There's a bunch of unclosed med list, no stop dates. There's a lot of synonyms. There's brand names and generic names. There's Coreg 12.5 milligrams BID and somewhere Coreg 25 milligrams once a day, all those kind of things. And you end up with this big, ugly list here again. So a lot of people have heard me say this in the past. MedRec, which is so important. If I have 5 other docs that are taking care of the same patient as I do, I believe the chance of all of our med lists being the same is absolutely 0. There's not even a 1% chance that we're going to match. So being able to see the intent of everybody out there and knowing there's going to be differences in that med list, of course, is important. Getting the fill data. So here is SureScripts data that we're receiving directly, so I can see what the patient actually gets. Now becomes very much closer to doing medication reconciliation. And again, our default view is not this. It's to group it by therapeutic class, and we can have a whole other discussion about the benefits to that from an accountable care standpoint, quality standpoint, et cetera. But to be able to say, okay, here's all the ACE inhibitors that were prescribed, or has this patient ever been on a beta blocker? If so, which ones? I can do that. But it makes that list, again, be much more palatable. And the same is true, by the way, that If we pick this Coreg and Zithromax from this recent hospitalization, send, here's my original med list, refresh, and here they are, and little smiley faces had some decision support in terms of formulary apply to that. And again, to the end user, it was a click. Nobody wants to know this was in Multum and it was, now I need to see it in RxNorm, or there was a terminology that was translated by IMO to SNOMED or something else. The end user doesn't care. They just see something, they say, I want it in my chart, click, and they want that to there. I do have to point out that that moving into the EMR piece, we're moving real rapidly on those workflows, and I'll talk more about those with Allscripts. We have the capability, because we do this standards-based with any EMR. Not all the EMRs are capable of taking a CCD and parsing it and saying, okay, I recognize that as a med, and it's got to go in this place on the med list or this place on the problem list. So I just want to be real careful that when you see that one click and the magic of just moving a piece of data like that seamlessly, it does that really nice with Allscripts products, but not necessarily does it so well with some of the other EMRs. But our goal is to be obviously agnostic to all of them. Problems and conditions, diagnosis, same thing. By the way, we can display these codes by their local code or what they've been translated into. And again, we could display them by types of problems. So you're probably going to get to the meat of the matter here. You could see most of us code as diabetes uncomplicated, but in fact, there's a whole bunch of diabetic complications that are grouped. Yes, Kate?
Steve Reno, I'm going to unmute and so can ask you this question.
Steve Reno, go ahead. Kate's unmuting you, so you have a question. Steve?
Okay. Here's his question. Are the medication categories normalized as well, Multum, first data, etc.?
So the question was, are the medication categories
Normalized as well?
Yes, they are. So we do that. So that, by the way, a lot of this work, and it depends on the client level, we can allow the clients to, not at the end user level, but on a hospital or a group or whatever during implementation, customize that grouping and a lot of the vocabulary mapping as well. So some clients, some very small clients, say, you know, we'll take everything out of the box, and I think that's the move from almost everybody. Really huge clients say we have our own specialized needs and we want to group things in our own localized terms, and we can certainly help with that as well. Other questions, Kate?
That's all I see right now.
Okay. Let's look at the labs for a second. Again, my intent, I can go as deep or as broad as anybody wants. There's another vocabulary issue here with the labs. Multiple labs, different reference ranges. Multiple labs, different terminologies. So a hemoglobin A1C in one lab might be a glycohemoglobin somewhere else, or an AST in one lab may be an SGOT in another lab. From an end user standpoint, the last thing I would ever expect is that I would have to know to scroll to the S's to see all the relevant liver function tests. Or if I'm looking at my glycohemoglobins, I would assume the computer was smart enough to include hemoglobin A1Cs, which is not the case with most statewide HIE solutions. So there's normalization of terminology. Again, it's presented in the terminology that the end user is used to seeing. So if I'm used to seeing something as a glycohemoglobin, all the hemoglobin A1Cs and glycohemoglobins will come over in that terminology to me, and it might be different than another user, again, who's consuming that in another language. The ability to graph this stuff is obvious. These, by the way, are not error bars. These are reference ranges, which you can see differ from lab to lab. An important point there, just to point out, clinically, not to underestimate this, is that a trend upward or downward may in fact not be a trend at all. It may just be an artifact of reference range differences between different labs, which people aren't used to until they're in the HIE world. So I point that out as another source of potential error that's going to occur in the HIE world. So a lot of people have heard me say this in the past. my lab view of choice is always this view. I never want to look at labs in my own EMR, ever, ever. And the reason for that is if I see a slightly abnormal lab, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I want to compare it to a previous one, and I don't want to compare it to my last lab that I drew. I want it to compare it to everywhere that's out in the community. So a lot of stuff, again, this becomes my go-to view. And when we go back again to that EHR agent that I showed in the beginning, the workflow hopefully will be clear to everybody. And I know I'm jumping around a lot of different places here. Real briefly, and again, my intent wasn't to go into every domain. I will point out some places, I'm lucky enough in Western Pennsylvania that the state registry is bidirectionally feeding and consuming data from DB Motion. So it means that the source of truth for immunizations is not my EMR by a long shot. So all the immunization data that goes to the state registry gets consumed in DB Motion. So this is where I go to for it, and vice versa. Anything I put in the chart or someone else does gets pushed up into that registry as well. I don't think I'm going to take time, unless people have questions, to go into some of these other domains, which I'd be glad to. I should just at least point out imaging. So imaging reports, pretty clear cut. The ability to show images within context. We are not a PACS repository. Organizations have that PACS capability. We do have the ability to do a URL call so we can show that image within the context of that report. So again, to the end user, it's pretty seamless. So let me jump ahead here for a second, because I mentioned about our ontology being the basis of this. Yes, Kate, is there a question?
Yeah, you know, Michael, I'm going to open up your line so you can ask this yourself. You know what? He hasn't had his PIN number, so I'll just read the question. Can you use the viewer of the PAC system to magnify, etc.?
Yeah. So again, all we're doing is bringing up that your own PACS view there. So we're doing that URL call. So whatever PACS capabilities that you have, the answer is yes, but please take that with a grain of salt. We don't have a lot of clients doing that right now. Most people are just content with reports within the DB Motion view. So there's probably a lot of nuances in the ability to manipulate those images within this view, and I'd just be careful answering that question from a technical standpoint. So what you see on the screen now is a diabetic view. And we're working hard, and this is one of the things where I think as we build our partnership and really look at the resources we have within the Allscripts family, is how we can do this much better. Our clients that are already starting down the patient-centered medical home path, for instance, this is really, really key. So what we're doing here is we're saying, if I want to look at a diabetic patient, why should I go hunting for all the diabetic stuff? Can't the ontology define that for me? So this view is not a hard-coded view of diabetic stuff. It's really an extension of that ontology. The ontology says, here's all the things that are related to diabetes, whether it's a problem, a med, et cetera. It means tomorrow, if there's a new concept in diabetes, we simply need to map that to the ontology and not rebuild this view from scratch. So the potential here for people to have one-click view, depending on their specialty, to manage care, this feeds directly into the population health stuff that we'll talk about in a second. But I wanted to show you this, and we can talk about how we're leveraging this further, what some of our clients are doing to develop their own views, et cetera. Questions on this, Kate?
Oh, I'm kidding.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to the population health view again, and then we'll come back to that agent that we saw in the beginning, unless people have any other needs to see any other detail here, which I'll be glad to show them. So I'm going ahead and clicking on what we call Collaborate. The name will become important in a second here. So let me reorient you to what you're seeing. So this is a pretty big departure from, I think, how we typically look at data. No matter what, we're still stuck in the world of pulling one chart and looking at one patient's piece of data. The idea is, how do we look at populations of patients prospectively and retrospectively for analytics, for population health management, et cetera. So on one hand, the use cases, and the clinicians have all been there. Patient comes in and I say, why are you here today, Mr. Jones? And he looks at me like I'm crazy because he's been in the hospital, or he's following up from the emergency room, or he's had some tests done. None of that's known to me. So I know what's happened to my patients once I pulled their chart, but I'm interested in the stuff that's happened that I don't know about. So now I can look at my entire population, and I can see any events that have happened in real time recently on them. Yes, Kate?
There's another question from Selman. Is there a published list of EMRs that are publishing the DV motion?
Is there a list of people that we have worked with already, other EMRs, that we actively have clients receiving data from them? The answer is yes, and I could get that to you offline. On the surface, the answer is probably, if you name one, we've probably worked with them. So, you know, all the major ones, eClin, Epic, you name it, on the outpatient side, on the ambulatory side, on the inpatient side, I think we've worked with everybody, Cerner, Epic, McKesson, et cetera. And we have clients with a whole bunch of little teeny EMR, mom and pop kind of ones as well. So I can get you that list. We are, and we are proud to say that we're agnostic to those. We don't have a lot of dependency on those EMRs. If they're sending data in any kind of standardized form, and sometimes not even standardized form, we're able to work with them and get that data. But I'll get you the list of our current clients and who we have active relationships with those EMRs. But we tend to think of ourselves as Switzerland with the other EMRs. The other questions, Kate?
He just said he'll send a specific EMR, and he'll send a list.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and I'd be glad to go over those as well. So getting back to Collaborate, what you're seeing here now, as I said, is here are all my patients, and these are patients that have had recent events. So for instance, Mr. Jones, why are you here today, or have you seen the cardiologist recently, or have you had this test? Now you can see across the top, he's had 2 emergency encounters. He's been in the hospital. He's had some outpatient encounters. There's new labs, radiology, alerts, orders, et cetera, here. So I can see those things across my entire population list across the top, and those events are listed down here. So for instance, this lab, if I click on it, it'll bring me into that lab clinical view, so I could see that. If there's a document here, this discharge summary, for instance, I can click on it here. So I can now see this across the enterprise for all my patients. And we'll talk about the workflow of this a little bit more in a second, and how in the future we're moving more of this information to the agent as well. Clearly, there's a whole piece here for practices that are still on paper, which I won't address right now unless people have questions about this. Originally, the intent of Collaborate was to serve as an EMR light, but the value here for population health is obviously very, very clear. So I can look at all my patients. I can look at my patients currently in the hospital. So from time to time during the day or before I go to bed at night, to see who's in the emergency room and sort of proactively work down that list, so to speak. Or this might be a hospital list or a quality care manager, et cetera. The other lists that we have, organizations can create their own list for the entire organization to see. So this might be our ACO patients, or it might be something that the organization's working at, patients that are at risk for falls or MRSA, or whatever the case may be. By the way, the end user certainly can drag and drop patients into any of these lists as well. Today, current product, out of the box, There are also some disease-specific lists. So that ontology concept that I brought to you earlier is defining what is a diabetic patient. The very important point here from a population health standpoint is that we're not using a problem list, an ICD-9 code, for instance, to define a diabetic. And I think the importance here from an ACO standpoint is I'm certainly more interested in my patients that haven't yet been defined as a diabetic. So the criteria here is based on, labs, problems, et cetera. It's standard-based based on a lot of the standard criteria that's out there for defining diabetes, and I can show you this if you'd like to. But the idea here is show me all the patients that are mine that are diabetics, and many of those I may not have defined as diabetes yet, and be able to follow those in the same way separately. Next version that's coming out is allowing two things: the end user to create their own custom lists. So if I'm, for instance, a pediatric rheumatologist and I want to follow my patients with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, I can drag and drop patients to that list. And the next version after that is to be able to have the end user actually manipulate the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So not just create a list and drag and drop, but actually define the rules that go into creating that population health piece. I see Kate's typing. Other questions?
No.
Okay. So this becomes the basis of the population health management piece here. By the way, I'm just going to, and please take this with a grain of salt, we have a couple clients that are doing patient-centered medical home that are taking this to this next level. This is not GA right now, but the next step is to do this, is to say, I'd like to see a diabetic list. So these are all my patients with diabetes, real time, not a report that's being driven overnight. So I click on it, show me patients that are continuously adding and dropping off this list. Now, since you have all the clinical data contained in DB Motion, go out and fetch all the stuff that I need to see for diabetes, like that clinical view that you saw earlier based on the ontology, and now show me what's in range, out of range, what's overdue, et cetera. So the ability to have an administrator run down a list like this and proactively go out and say, here are the people that are overdue for this, that, or the other thing, or show me the patients that are grossly out of range with their hemoglobin A1C. This is really where we believe is going to be the basis of ACO management. I am sure that there are a lot of questions out there in terms of analytics and reporting, which I'll be glad to talk about. I will state that there is a lot of overlap right now within the Allscripts world, and where does this belong? I'll share with you my own belief is that the word analytics probably means a bigger thing. I think to be able to do reporting on population health clearly has some basis here, and if we can do that at the point of care, that'll be useful to physicians as well. So I'll be glad to talk about that if people have questions there as well. So this is the collaborate piece. Let me just point out one other thing before I leave this. I mentioned the ability to communicate within and outside the HIE. So for instance, if I have this transition of care document and I want to send it to another doctor, you could see it's already attached here. We maintain the doctor-patient relationship, so I can choose the members of the care team that I want to communicate to. I could send a quick message to them here. And the cool thing is, when I send this message, I have an outbound TASA, so I can keep track of the stuff I've sent out that hasn't been responded to yet, and vice versa, stuff that's been sent to me. And to answer those of you who are a little bit more advanced in this, the capability of sending and receiving messages by the direct project is built into this as well. So to the end user, I could send a message securely from this platform, collaborate to collaborate, or if I wanted to send a message to someone else outside of my HIE via secure email, i.e. the direct project, again, the workflow would be exactly the same to me. So communication piece here is probably going to be just as important as we start doing this collaborative care model. So again, I know there's probably a lot of overlap with other things that you've seen, other Allscripts products. I'll tell you that we're actively trying to figure out where those similarities, where we augment each other, where some of these, where we're stepping on toes, and how we can sort of streamline some of this. Yes, Kate?
Michael Suleiman asked, are you referring to Care Director?
Yeah, so Care Director is another one in particular. Care Director as an administrative tool, as a transactional tool, clearly has a lot more superiority than this, and has a lot of overlap on the clinical side as well. Is there value to a care director to use this to follow, CHF patients beyond the bricks and mortar of the hospital and get clinical information? The answer is yes, but where do those workflows and how do we sort of match those products up? You're dead on, and that's one of the active discussions we're clearly just starting at in this relationship right now. But that's clearly an area where I know there's overlap and a lot of questions, and figure out how do we get the best of breed here. Other questions? We're good?
Yep.
Okay. So I do want to go back to the EHR agent here so we can see that. Because again, you'll be able to see this all together. So let me go ahead and do that again. So this is where we were in the beginning for some of those of you who missed this. The workflow, again, is not to have any of those tools that are disruptive to my workflow, but again, to work in my EMR, regardless whether it's an Allscripts EMR or not, but to have this floating window up here, flash only when there's relevant information. When there is, bring it to me at the point of care, as I said here. The piece that I want to add to this from a population health standpoint is this. So now, because we have a point of care tool, at the very least, if I'm an emergency room doctor and I know that a patient's in a population being monitored for diabetes, now I can start doing some cool ACO kind of stuff. In the future, again, I don't want to jump off too much here, but clearly we're going to enter a world where a patient coming in to get his finger laceration sewed up, in the past that may not be the ED doctor's job to make sure they've had a urine microalbumin done because they're a diabetic, but in an ACO world, that may be the only point of care of that particular patient to be able to do some of that quality management. So to take that population health information and bring it to the point of care is really, really important. And then the next set is to bring those clinical alerts that you see here to the point of care. So really when I say, has there been a hemoglobin A1C done on my patient, I'm really not caring what's in my EMR. I'm really asking the world, does anybody have a hemoglobin A1C? If so, what was the last one and what was the value? Or if not, how overdue is this patient for it? So that's the value of having that HIE information, doing the population health hard, heavy lifting in the background, and then having this agent and bringing it to the point of care. So there's a lot of other pieces here talking about bringing some analytic information to the point of care. So for instance, if I'm seeing a diabetic patient, if I was able to just see my diabetic scorecard compared to my peer group at the point of care, would it motivate me to change my behavior at the point of care? Perhaps. I would say very likely it would be. And then there's a whole other discussion here about clinical decision support on the enterprise, which I'll be glad to talk about, but I'll set aside for right now in the interest of time here. So, yeah, so we have a fair amount of time for question and answer right now. And again, it was hard without getting direct feedback. I apologize that we've had to have everybody muted right now. So I know I've talked real rapidly, gave you a pretty good overview of things, but clearly devil's in the details here.
Sherry, are you there? I just unmuted you. I wonder what your feeling is about letting people, just opening up the lines and seeing if people want to talk.
I'm not on the phone line.
Hi, are you there? Hi. I heard you for a minute. Sherry, is that you? Okay. Well, we can do that if there's a discussion to be had, if people have questions to ask, or we can stop soon. So
I hope this was helpful. As I said, I would love to sit down and talk to people one-on-one or face-to-face if we have a forum to do that in the future, because I know I have a million questions to ask you guys. I've lived in this world, but I need to see beyond it, and I need to understand people's concept of workflow a lot more.
okay, there are questions coming in, actually. So Sherry just responded. She said, I can hear you, but you can't me. I'm just wondering earlier if Collaborate is a separate module sold separately?
So Collaborate, A, is a separate module in the sense it's a different view. None of us are happy with its workflow, so to speak. In terms of the licensing of Collaborate, I'm not sure. I'll leave the salespeople to talk about how they license that. Typically, most clients are buying it together as part of the package deal. I will tell you that Collaborate has become unbelievably hot right now, and a lot of people just didn't get it a couple years ago for whatever reason, and now all of a sudden are very, very interested in that. So I can get you what the current thoughts are on pricing and how we license that, but off the top of my head, I have to say I'll probably say something wrong.
We have some other questions, too. From Susan Snyder, she said, can we see the patients at risk again and talk to it? She thinks she missed that.
Patients at risk. So let me go back. I'm assuming that you are referring, oops. So I'm assuming you meant this button right here that said patients at risk. If so, what that is, in the Collaborate model, that was, again, organizationally, an organization could set a view, a population, whatever they want. Is that right, Kate?
I unmuted her.
So Sherry, who is it?
Susan Snyder.
Susan, I think you're unmuted if you want to go ahead and talk now.
So I'm just curious on what populates that and where that information is coming from.
So it was a request that we had from organizations to set beyond the ability to personalize at the end user level. So I want to see my patients that have X, Y, Z. But the organization says, you know, we have a need here. We have an outreach program for elderly at risk for falls or whatever the case may be, or a hepatitis A outbreak in the community. So organizationally, it lets the organization define a population in any way they may want to, just by a list, for instance, or by some clinical criteria, and then make a sort of universal list that everybody gets to see or has to see, so to speak. So that's sort of limitless in its possibilities. So that's where that came from, but that really could be almost anything that the organization wants a universal list for everybody to see.
Okay.
Did you have any thoughts on that or value there? Or?
Well, and I think about, I'm the director of the acute team in Sunrise for the demos, and for HIMSS, we had done a population health story and, you know, identifying certain patients at risk and utilizing, talking to points of care director or care manager on how you'd be observing them and watching them. So I guess it's similar. Just wanted to know if you had it populated and what story workflow you had to go with it.
Well, to be honest, I think, and this is one of the areas I'd love to talk to you more about, I think we're particularly weak in terms of that overall story. And I hope I fixed that right. And particularly around the demo, I would love to develop a clear story with this. And so if you think that there's areas that work best from a use case scenario, then I'd like to tell a common story here with that. So right now, it looks pretty, I would say, patients at risk, and there's nothing populates it. So I think our next demo, we should probably have some nice pieces there that match the other Allscripts family products and populate that at will. So if you have any ideas on that,
okay.
Reach out to me directly, because we're still, right now, we're trying to build a much better demo and tell a common story. So I agree, this looks really sparse here. We could do a much better job. Thank you.
Great. I'll reach out to you.
Thank you.
Sherry she followed up with a few more questions. She said, regarding conflicts with current solutions on Allscripts side, analytics, do we plan to have that ironed out by ACE?
Okay, so the question, do we have the analytics conflicts ironed out by ACE? I don't know.
Right.
I certainly wish. The problem, Sherry, as I think a lot of people out there know, is if you ask 10 people what analytics is, you'll get 20 different answers. And from my standpoint, there's a lot of different, we have to define that to ourselves, what we mean by analytics. There is predictive analytics, there's prescriptive analytics, there's descriptive analytics. I think, as I said, from my standpoint, as it relates to reporting on population health stuff, I could certainly share with you that and our concept for that. But I think the deeper analytics, especially when it comes to costing and things like that, there's a lot of overlapping and moving target pieces here, and we definitely need to move this. It's very, very confusing to clients. So at the very least, I would hope, and one of my goals is that we have the talking points worked out by ACE. I'm not sure we'll know all the working parts, but this is one of the areas that I'd love to talk to as many people as possible within our own family right now. So I'm not saying things when I'm talking to clients or prospective clients that are confusing to them either. And the same with the care coordination piece too. I want to avoid any sense of confusion from a client standpoint.
Salman has some other questions as well, and he's ready to be unmuted. He was in a noisy place before, so although Salman, I just sent you a pin, so if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and talk on the phone, I'll unmute you so you can ask your questions. Let's see. Yeah, he had a few, so if we can get him on the line, that'd be great.
And while we're waiting, Sherry and whoever else, this analytic thing I think is so key. So I would love to figure out another forum, or this one if the case may be, but this to me is really where I sense a great opportunity for us, but I also think there's going to be some huge hurdles, and I'd love it if this group or a subset of it or a larger group, we can start having some open and frank discussions around this.
Okay, so Salman's unmuted now. Salman, go ahead if you want to ask your questions.
Thank you. So I work with the Sunrise Clinical Optimization team. What we try to do in most places is to solve for data coming from different EMRs within a large hospital setting. A different system in the ED, a different system in the OR, a different system in L&D. A lot of times we do have to have sort of compound measures at the end of the overall stay, which look across all of these 4 or 5 different components. So we're not only looking at getting access to documents in some cases, but also discrete data. For instance, if the antibiotic stop time or administration time was reported in the OR system, we want to see it in STM so we could continue to report on post-op day measures for proper antibiotic administration. How would you envision getting discrete data from documents or reports from other systems into STM if possible? I mean, I know we saw health issues, allergies, medications. Would you have some sort of an ontology that could normalize discrete documentation data and pull it into STM as well?
So you're talking about non-discrete data that's buried in text right now?
Not non-discrete, but let's say it's discrete data, because in the OR, they may actually have some sort of a flow sheet or a document where they're discretely documenting stop time for anesthesia, or incision time, or delivery time in an L&D record. Those not
so
non-discrete.
one thing that we should do is, and again, I'll be glad to put you in touch with the right people. So at HCA, for instance, our project with them is exactly that. It's an analytic piece. By the way, IBM is the analytic tool that's consuming our data. So they're taking whatever data we could possibly get, we normalize it, and we have something called a clinical analytics gateway. We call it CAG. That's just a pipe that feeds that analytic tool. So the same could be said for any other analytic tools, including Allscripts analytics tools. So if we can get that data in any way, and we have all sorts of creative ways of doing that. So there is, at HCA, for instance, exactly that. Some of that OR information, a lot of other detailed data that probably doesn't have any clinical value within the HIE, but has a huge amount of value from a much more advanced analytic capability using that clinical analytics gateway. So one of the things that might be helpful to that is I could put you in touch with the right folks from our team that are dealing with that analytics gateway and talk to you about the kind of data that they're getting from other clients that are doing that and what the plans are with that, and probably familiarize you a lot more with that. Would that be helpful?
That would be extremely helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so reach out to me directly, and I'll make sure I channel you to the right people, and they could kind of open up things there and talk to you in more detail about that and help solve whatever issues you have there if we can be of help in that area.
Thanks.
I don't see any other questions right now. Selman, I'll send you Dr. Diamond's email address.
And for everybody, by the way, it's joel.diamond@dbmotion.com. Actually, if you put Joel at dbmotion.com, I'm the only Joel, so it'll get to me. So joel@dbmotion.com. And please feel free to reach out to me directly. So I really appreciate everybody's time today. As I said, I'd love to be able to get a face-to-face with as many people as possible, because I think there's a whole bunch of work we need to do here, and I really would love to hear more candid feedback here so we could start moving forward. This is exciting for me, and I love being part of this bigger team. You guys have done so many cool things in so many areas, and I think for me to absorb as much of that experience as possible and figure out how we can make a better product here overall is very exciting. So thank you, everyone. Any other questions, Kate?
Yeah, it just says this is great. Anyone else doing this? Any main competitor? That was from Sherry.
So Sherry, so the question was, who else is doing this? One of the things, the things where we're, I think, still very, very ahead of the curve are two things. One is the vocabulary semantic piece. We continue to be very, very far ahead. Other people are just starting to claim they do semantic interoperability, but they're still doing a lot of manually mapping. I know that our lead has been narrowing very, very quickly along that edge. But the second piece of this is having that EHR agent. So bringing this information to the point of care and having that semantics on top of that is huge. And now having this population health piece. So when you put all those together, and again, they're so highly reliant on each other. You have to be able to have all the data. You have to be able to normalize it. You have to understand the vocabulary, and you have to be able to present it at the point of care. I think we're still real far ahead. Having said that, I know some of our competition is doing this as well. And the other piece that's worrisome from a competition standpoint is the other EHRs are starting to claim that they can do some of this stuff. So Epic, whether they can or not, says they do interoperability, says they do semantics. Cerner is starting to say they're doing population health management, et cetera. So we can argue whether they're really doing it or not, but you know, certainly they can make a good show of it as well, and it's a lot easier when you're in a monolithic system to be able to control that data. So I think, you know, we still need to work real fast here to move out ahead. I think we have a huge window, but probably a very short one to be leaders in this area. Great. All right, thank you, everybody. Please reach out to me directly. Thanks for everybody's time and patience with our technical difficulties here. I appreciate it. Thanks, Kate and Rob, for helping me out here.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.